the stench hit us first. It was July 22nd, 1991, a sweltering summer night in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We were responding to a call about a disturbance, a man with handcuffs dangling from one wrist. What we found inside apartment 213 would sear itself into our memories and the nation's consciousness forever.
The apartment was Jeffrey Dahmer's lair. Scattered throughout were Polaroid photos of dismembered bodies posed in grotesque tableaus. The refrigerator held a human head. In a vat, police discovered decomposing body parts dissolving in acid. The air was thick with the odor of death, a macabre testament to the horrors that had unfolded within those walls.
News of the discovery spread like wildfire, plunging the city into a state of shock and disbelief. The seemingly ordinary apartment building had masked a chamber of horrors, and a monster had walked among us undetected for years.
The man with the handcuffs, Tracy Edwards, would become instrumental in unraveling Dahmer's reign of terror. His escape had been the catalyst, leading police directly to the scene of unspeakable crimes. The investigation that followed was like no other. The sheer volume of evidence, the depravity of the acts, and the number of victims, 17, confirmed shocked even seasoned detectives.
As we dug deeper, we unearthed a chilling pattern of seduction, murder, and unspeakable acts. Each victim, mostly young men from marginalized communities, had been lured to Dahmer's apartment, drugged and murdered. Their bodies, desecrated and dismembered, became objects in Dahmer's twisted fantasies.
The nation watched in horror as details of Dahmer's crimes emerged. This wasn't just murder, it was a descent into the darkest recesses of human depravity. The case became a morbid spectacle, a gruesome puzzle that investigators painstakingly pieced together, each fragment more horrifying than the last.
Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer's crimes were not impulsive acts of violence. They were meticulously planned and executed, each step driven by a chillingly calculated madness. He would frequent gay bars and bus stations, preying on vulnerable young men, often offering them money or a place to stay. Once inside his apartment, Dahmer would drug his victims, rendering them helpless. Then, the true horror began.
He would strangle them, often engaging in necrophilia afterwards. Driven by a perverse desire to possess his victims completely, he would dismember their bodies, preserving select parts as trophies. Photographs taken with a Polaroid camera became his twisted mementos. He documented his crimes in grotesque detail, posing the bodies in various states of dismemberment.
These images, later discovered by police, provided a chilling glimpse into the mind of a killer obsessed with control and domination. Beyond the murders themselves, Dahmer engaged in acts of cannibalism. He admitted to consuming the flesh of some of his victims, driven by a warped desire to make them a permanent part of him.
This gruesome detail sent shockwaves through the nation, solidifying Dahmer's place in the annals of criminal history as a monster of unparalleled depravity. His apartment became a macabre workshop of death. The stench of decay was overpowering, masked by incense and air fresheners. Human skulls were found in his bedroom, bleached and painted, transformed into macabre decorations. A stockpot on the stove contained a human heart.
The evidence painted a horrifying picture of a man consumed by his dark desires, his humanity utterly eclipsed by his monstrous compulsions. The meticulous nature of his crimes, the methodical dismemberment, and the preservation of body parts revealed a chilling lack of remorse. It was as if Dahmer saw his victims not as human beings but as objects, playthings to be manipulated and discarded at will.
This cold, calculating aspect of his crimes made them all the more terrifying. He wasn't driven by a fit of rage but by a chillingly detached obsession.
Among the 17 victims identified, the story of Tony Anthony Hughes stands out as particularly heart-wrenching. Hughes, a deaf-mute aspiring model, was just 31 years old when he crossed paths with Dahmer at a gay bar in May of 1990.
Hughes's world was one of silence, but he navigated it with a radiant smile and an eagerness to connect with others. He communicated through sign language and writing, his gentle nature endearing him to those who knew him. Dahmer, sensing Hughes's vulnerability, saw an opportunity to exploit his trusting nature.
Hughes was last seen leaving the bar with Dahmer. He had no way of knowing the danger that lurked behind the killer's charming facade. Inside Dahmer's apartment, Hughes met the same fate as the others. Drugged, murdered, and dismembered, his body became another gruesome addition to Dahmer's collection of horrors.
His disappearance left a void in the deaf community, and his family clung to hope, unaware of the gruesome truth. It wasn't until Dahmer's arrest that they received the devastating confirmation of Tony's fate. The news shattered their world, leaving them grappling with the unimaginable pain of losing their beloved Tony in such a horrific manner.
Hughes's murder, like the others, highlighted the vulnerability of those living on the margins of society. Dahmer preyed on individuals who were often overlooked or dismissed, their disappearances sometimes going unnoticed or unreported for extended periods. Tony Hughes, a young man full of life and promise, became a tragic symbol of the indiscriminate nature of hate and the devastating consequences of predatory violence.
Section 4, Conarack Sinthasomphone, a Preventable Tragedy. The case of Conarack Sinthasomphone revealed a chilling failure of the system, a failure that cost a 14-year-old boy his life.
In May 1991, Sinthasomphone, a Laotian immigrant, managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment, naked and bleeding, but disoriented from the drugs he'd been given.
Two women, Glenda Cleveland and Nicole Childress, witnessed Sinthasomphone's desperate attempts to flee Dahmer. They called 911, pleading with the dispatcher to send help.
When police arrived, Dahmer convinced them that Sinthasomphone was his 19-year-old lover, involved in a drunken domestic dispute. Despite the boy's obvious distress and the women's protests, the officers returned Sinthasomphone to Dahmer's apartment. The officers' decision, influenced by a combination of negligence, homophobia, and racial bias, had fatal consequences.
Sinthasomphone, deemed a nuisance rather than a victim in need of rescue, was taken back into the clutches of his tormentor. He was murdered by Dahmer shortly after the police left.
This horrific miscarriage of justice sparked outrage and fueled accusations of police incompetence and racial profiling. The incident became a tragic example of how systemic biases can blind authorities to the plight of marginalized individuals with deadly consequences.
The Sinthasomphone family, already reeling from the unimaginable loss of their son, was left to grapple with the knowledge that his death could have been prevented. The case underscored the urgent need for police reform, for cultural sensitivity training, and for a system that values the lives and safety of all its citizens equally, regardless of race, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic status.
Conarack Sinthasomphoni's story became a tragic reminder of the human cost of indifference and the devastating consequences of failing to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Section 5. Richard Guerrero, a life cut short, remembered by Janie Hagen. 19-year-old Richard Guerrero was full of life, a young man with a bright future ahead of him.
He was the apple of his mother's eye, and his sister, Janie Hagen, adored him. In March 1988, Richard met Dahmer at a gay bar in Milwaukee. Like so many others, he was lured by Dahmer's charm, unaware of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. Richard never returned home.
His family, frantic with worry, reported him missing, but their pleas for help went unanswered. Days turned into weeks, then months, their hope dwindling with each passing day. They were left in agonizing limbo, clinging to the hope that Richard was still alive somewhere, somehow.
It wasn't until Dahmer's arrest that the gruesome truth was revealed. Richard had been drugged, strangled, and dismembered, his remains disposed of like garbage. The news shattered the Guerrero family. Their grief was compounded by the knowledge that their beloved Richard had suffered a horrific fate at the hands of a monster.
Janie Hagen, in a powerful victim impact statement delivered at Dahmer's sentencing, refused to let her brother be remembered as just another victim. She spoke of his kindness, his infectious laugh, and the void his absence left in their lives. Her words, filled with both grief and defiance, painted a vivid picture of a life cut tragically short, a life stolen by a predator hiding in plain sight.
Richard Guerrero's story, like those of the other victims, underscored the human cost of Dahmer's crimes. Behind the headlines and the gruesome details were real people, loved ones whose lives were forever shattered by the loss of someone dear. Their pain served as a stark reminder that the true horror of Dahmer's crimes extended far beyond the walls of his apartment, leaving behind a trail of grief and devastation that would span generations.